Father, might there be supper tonight?
The child did not weep. She stood at the threshold of her father's study, small hands clasped together before her, as though she had been taught that want was impolite. The room beyond glowed with a single candle. Its flame danced across the polished surface of the Duke's writing desk, catching on something there. Gold, stacked in careful towers, coins arranged by value, by year of minting, by weight. She watched them gleam. "Father," she whispered, her voice thin as parchment, "might there be supper tonight?" Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Ravensmere, did not raise his eyes. His quill moved steadily across the ledger before him, recording the day's accounts with precision that bordered on devotion. Each figure entered, each column balanced. The scratching of the nib against paper was the only sound between them. "There is bread in the kitchen," he said at length, his tone measured, deliberate. "You ate yesterday." The child's fingers tightened against one another. "We shared the bread yesterday, Father, among the three of us." Margaret said her stomach aches. Henry grows faint during his lessons. The Duke's hand paused. For the span of a breath, the quill hovered. Then it resumed its course. "Fasting strengthens the spirit," he said. "It teaches restraint. Your brother will thank me when he is grown. You may go." The child stood another moment. Something crossed her face, something too old for her years. Then she curtsied, turned, and withdrew into the darkened corridor beyond. The door closed softly. The Duke reached for a velvet pouch beside his elbow and drew forth a handful of sovereigns. He counted them, sorted them, or returned them to their place. Then he opened a drawer and withdrew another ledger, this one bound in calf skin, its pages filled with figures that represented wealth enough to feed a village for a year. Outside the study, Ravensmere estate stretched vast and cold. The fires in the grates burned low, kept deliberately so to preserve coal. The corridors held a chill that seeped through wool and into bone. In the chambers above, 3 children lay beneath threadbare blankets, listening to the sound of their own hunger. Somewhere in the East Wing, Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, Duchess of Ravensmere, sat beside a window with needlework in her lap. Her hands had grown too unsteady to thread the needle. She did not call for a candle. Candles were counted. She had been beautiful once, before the hunger, before the silence, was before the understanding that gratitude could become a cage. The Duke did not think of her now. He thought only of the ledger, of the coins, of the careful preservation of what he had accumulated. Years ago, he had settled a gentleman's debts, enormous debts, ruinous debts that would have destroyed a family's name and sent them into exile. He had paid them all, every pound, every shilling. In exchange, he had taken a wife. He had called it an honorable arrangement. He had counted the cost with precision, and in his mind, he had paid enough. The candle burned lower, the gold remained, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the study walls, a household waited for mercy that would not come. Not tonight. Not for years. Not until one particular evening, when the smallest child would collapse before a room full of witnesses, and the Duke of Ravensmere would learn that there are debts that gold cannot settle. Edmund Ashcroft believed in order. He believed in ledgers balanced to the penny, in servants who knew their place, in children who did not speak unless addressed. He believed that waste was sin, and that comfort bred weakness. He had inherited Ravensmere at the age of 23, along with a fortune that most men could only dream of possessing. Lands, investments, holdings that stretched across 3 counties. His father had been a shrewd man, calculating in all things, and Edmund had learned well. By the time he reached 30, The Duke's wealth had doubled. By 35, it had tripled. He took satisfaction in this. Not the spending of it, never that. But the accumulation, the proof that he was master of his own house, his own fate, his own fortune. His household ran like clockwork. Breakfast at 7. No more than 2 eggs per person. Fires lit only in rooms currently occupied. Candles measured and distributed weekly. Servants paid quarterly, not a day early. Every purchase recorded. Every expense justified. The other gentlemen of his acquaintance found this amusing. Ashcroft runs his estate like a counting house, they would say over port and cards. Every stick of wood accounted for, every morsel weighed. They did not understand. They squandered their inheritances on horses and mistresses and gambling debts. They borrowed against their estates to fund London seasons that left them bankrupt by autumn. They were fools. Edmund would never be a fool. On this particular morning, he sat in his study, reviewing the household accounts from the previous month. The numbers pleased him. Seafood expenses down by nearly 1/3. Coal consumption reduced. Even the candle expenditure had decreased. A knock interrupted his concentration. Enter. The house steward stepped inside, a man named Graves who had served the family for 30 years. His face carried the neutral expression of one who had learned not to question. Your Grace, the cook wishes to speak with you regarding the week's provisions. Edmund did not look up from his ledger. The provisions were decided on Monday. There is nothing further to discuss. Your Grace, she believes the quantities insufficient for the household's needs. Now Edmund raised his eyes. They were grey, cold as winter stone. Insufficient, he repeated. The household consists of myself, my wife, 3 children, and 12 servants. I have calculated precisely what is required. What if the cook finds my calculations insufficient? Perhaps she is too generous with portions. Graves hesitated. A dangerous thing. The children, Your Grace. They are growing. Young Master Henry in particular has been. Young Master Henry, Edmund interrupted, is 9 years old. At his age I received 1 meal per day and was grateful for it. It did not harm me. On the contrary, it taught me the value of what I possessed. Yes, Your Grace. Tell the cook that if she cannot manage the provisions I have allocated, I will find someone who can. Very good, Your Grace. Graves withdrew. Edmund returned to his ledger. But something nagged at him. Not conscience. He had long ago trained himself away from such sentimentality. Rather, it was the sense that others didn't understand. Could not understand. He had done what was necessary, but what was right. 7 years ago, Lady Eleanor Fairley had been the daughter of a baron who gambled too much and invested poorly. Her father's debts had mounted to staggering sums. The family faced ruin, public disgrace, debtor's prison for the baron himself. Edmund had been searching for a wife. Not for love, he had no patience for such nonsense, but for the practical matter of an heir. Lady Eleanor was beautiful, well-bred, and appropriately educated. She would suit. He had approached her father with a proposition. He would settle all debts in full. In return, he would have Eleanor's hand in marriage. The baron had wept with gratitude. Eleanor had said nothing. She had merely curtsied and accepted. The wedding had been modest. Edmund saw no reason for extravagance. He had already spent a fortune rescuing her family from their own foolishness. Anything more would be wasteful. She had given him 3 children, Henry, Margaret, and Anne. His duty was fulfilled. Her duty was fulfilled. There was nothing more required. He had provided a home, a name, security. If she seemed wan and quiet, if she rarely smiled, well, that was the natural consequence of understanding one's place in the world. Edmund closed the ledger and stood. Through the window, he could see the grounds of Ravensmere stretching away toward the woods. His land, his legacy. He had built this through discipline, through restraint, through understanding that wealth was not for spending, but for preserving. Somewhere in the house, a child coughed, a thin rattling sound that carried through the walls. Edmund did not hear it, or perhaps he chose not to. Eleanor remembered the day she became a duchess, not because of joy, not because of hope, but because it was the day she learned that freedom could be purchased and that she was the price. She had been 21, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to believe she had no choice. Her father had called her into his study one afternoon in late spring, the study where he had spent so many hours bent over cards and racing forms, convinced that the next wager would restore everything. It never had. "Eleanor," he had said, and his voice shook. "I have found a solution." She had known immediately what he meant, not by the words themselves, but by the way he could not meet her eyes, by the way his hands trembled as he poured himself brandy at midday. "The Duke of Ravensmere has made an offer," her father continued, "a generous offer. He will settle all our debts, every one of them, in full." Eleanor had stood very still. "What does he ask in return?" Her father drained his glass. "Your hand in marriage." She had known it would come to this. For months, she had watched her mother grow pale with worry, had heard the arguments behind closed doors, had seen the letters arrive with increasing frequency, each one stamped with the seals of creditors who would not wait much longer. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "Have you accepted?" she asked. "I told him I would speak with you first." But they both knew it was not truly a question. Her father's debts exceeded £20,000. Without the Duke's intervention, they would lose everything. The estate, the house in London. Her younger brother would have no future. Her mother would be ruined. Eleanor had walked to the window. Outside, the gardens were in bloom. She had spent her childhood in those gardens, reading beneath the oak trees, picking roses with her mother. She would never see them again. "What is he like?" she asked quietly. "Respectable, wealthy, disciplined, not kind, not gentle, not warm, but respectable." "Then I accept," Eleanor said. Her father had embraced her then, weeping openly, thanking her, calling her his salvation. Eleanor had felt nothing, or perhaps she had felt everything, and it had frozen solid inside her. The wedding took place 6 weeks later. Small, private. The Duke had seen no reason for extravagance, he said. He had already spent enough. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue silk that had belonged to her mother. No flowers, or no music beyond what the church provided. No celebration afterward. Edmund had stood beside her at the altar, tall and rigid, his expression unchanged throughout the ceremony. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Edmund had nodded once. That was all. They travelled to Ravensmere that same afternoon. The journey took 4 hours. Edmund spent it reviewing correspondence. He did not speak to her. When they arrived, he showed her to her chambers, separate from his own. "You will find everything you require here," he said. "Meals are at fixed hours. I do not permit changes to the schedule. You will receive a household allowance quarterly. It is to cover your personal needs. Use it wisely." Eleanor had looked around the room. It was beautifully appointed and utterly cold. "Is there anything else, Your Grace?" He had paused at the door. "Yes," he said. "I expect you to understand that I have fulfilled my obligation to your family. I settled debts that were not mine to settle. I saved your father from ruin. That was my gift to you. I will not be asked for more." Then he left. Eleanor had stood alone in that beautiful cold room and understood exactly what her life would be. She was not a wife. She was a debt paid, a transaction completed. And Edmund believed that because he had spent a fortune to acquire her, he owed nothing more. Not comfort, not kindness, not warmth. Certainly not love. 7 years had passed since that day. Eleanor had given him 3 children. Henry first, then Margaret 2 years later, then Anne. Each birth had weakened her further. Each time, Edmund had sent physicians only when absolutely necessary, for physicians cost money. Now she sat in the drawing room, trying to read by the fading afternoon light. Reading was one of the few pleasures left to her, but even that had become difficult. The words blurred, her hands shook. She was hungry, always hungry now. They all were. The door opened. Anne entered, her youngest daughter, barely 6 years old. The child's dress hung loosely on her thin frame. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes too large for her face. "Mama," Anne whispered. "I asked Father about supper." Eleanor set down her book. "What did he say?" "He said there is bread, and that we ate yesterday." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Bread. Always bread. Hard, dry bread that scratched the throat and left the stomach still aching. "Come here, darling," she said softly. Anne climbed into her lap. The child weighed almost nothing. "Mama, why does Father keep all the gold in his study?" Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair. It had grown brittle. "Because he believes it keeps us safe," Eleanor said quietly. "But we are hungry." "I know. Cannot you ask him, Mama? Cannot you tell him we need more?" Eleanor held her daughter closer. How could she explain? How could she tell this child that she had tried, in the beginning? That she had gone to Edmund with careful words, with gentle requests? That he had looked at her with those cold grey eyes and reminded her of her father's debts, of the £20,000 he had spent, of how ungrateful it was to ask for more? How could she say that she had learned silence because anything else was pointless? "Hush now," Eleanor whispered. "Rest. You will feel better in the morning." It was a lie, they both knew it. But what else could she offer? That night, Eleanor lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere, footsteps moved along the corridor. Somewhere, Edmund sat in his study, counting gold. And Eleanor thought about the girl she had been at 21, the girl who had believed she had no choice. She wondered if that girl would recognize her now. Eleanor woke each morning to the same grey light. Dawn came slowly to Ravensmere, creeping through heavy curtains that had not been replaced in years. The fabric had faded from deep crimson to something closer to rust. Eleanor noticed such things now, how everything around her was wearing away, including herself. She rose from bed carefully, her head swimming with the effort. The room tilted briefly before settling. This happened most mornings now. She had learned to move slowly, to wait for her vision to clear before attempting the stairs. Her maid, a young woman named Sarah, entered with a pitcher of cold water. There was no warm water. Heating water required fuel, and fuel was rationed. "Good morning, Your Grace," Sarah said quietly. The girl's face was pinched with hunger. All the servants looked that way now. "Good morning, Sarah." Eleanor washed and dressed, declining the offer of help. She had learned to manage her own laces, her own buttons. It was simpler than watching Sarah's hands shake from weakness. The dress she wore had been altered 3 times, first when she grew with child, then again after each birth. Now it hung loose despite the alterations, the fabric gathering at her waist where flesh had once filled it. She descended to breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock. Edmund insisted on punctuality. The breakfast room was cold. The fire had been lit only an hour earlier, not long enough to warm the stone walls. Eleanor took her seat at the far end of the table, as far from Edmund as the room allowed. He was already there, reading correspondence while he ate. He did not acknowledge her arrival. A plate was set before her. 1 egg, boiled, a small piece of bread, weak tea without milk or sugar. Eleanor ate slowly, making it last. The egg was undersized, likely from hens that were themselves underfed. The bread was coarse and grey, but it was food, and she was grateful for it, even as her stomach protested that it was not enough. Across the table, Edmund ate methodically. 2 eggs, 3 pieces of bread with butter, hot tea with cream and sugar. He had calculated, he once told her, what the precise number of calories required to maintain his constitution. He had not performed similar calculations for anyone else. "The children will take breakfast in the nursery," Edmund said, without looking up from his letters. "Yes, Edmund. I have instructed cook to limit portions. They have been overindulging." Eleanor's hand tightened on her fork. Overindulging. Her children, who cried themselves to sleep with hunger pains, who had grown so thin their clothes had to be taken in monthly. "They are growing children," she said carefully. "They require proper nourishment." Now Edmund did look up. His eyes were cold, assessing. "They require discipline," he said. "As do you, madam, if you presume to question my management of this household." Eleanor lowered her gaze. This was the price of speaking, swift rebuke, what the reminder of her place. "Forgive me, Your Grace." "See that you remember it." He returned to his letters. The conversation was finished. Eleanor finished her meagre breakfast and rose. Edmund did not bid her good morning. He never did. She climbed the stairs to the nursery, each step requiring more effort than it should. By the time she reached the top, she was breathless. The children were gathered around a small table by the window. Henry sat very straight, trying to set an example for his sisters. Margaret picked at her food with the careful attention of someone trying to make it last. Anne simply stared at her plate, too tired even to eat. "Good morning, my darlings," Eleanor said, keeping her voice bright. "Good morning, Mamma," they chorused, though Anne's voice was barely a whisper. Eleanor crossed to Anne and placed a hand on her forehead. The child was warm, not fevered yet, but warm enough to worry. "Are you unwell, sweetheart?" Anne leaned into her mother's touch. "Just tired, Mama." "She didn't sleep well," Margaret offered quietly. "She was crying in the night." Eleanor knelt beside Anne's chair, ignoring the protest of her own weak knees. "What troubles you, my love?" Anne's eyes filled with tears. "My stomach hurts, Mamma. It hurts all the time now." Eleanor pulled her daughter close, feeling how light she was, how fragile, like holding a bird. "I know, darling, I know." "Will it always hurt, Mamma?" Eleanor had no answer for that. How could she promise it would stop when she knew it would not? When she knew that tomorrow would bring the same ache, the same emptiness, the same quiet suffering? Henry stood abruptly. "I will speak to Father," he said, his young voice attempting authority. "I will tell him we need more food." "No," Eleanor said sharply, too sharply. She softened her tone. "No, Henry, you must not." "But Mamma, your father has made his decisions. We must respect them." Henry's hands clenched into fists. "But they are wrong decisions. Anne is sick. Margaret is weak. You are—" He stopped himself, but Eleanor knew what he had been about to say. "You are fading." She was. They all knew it. "We endure," Eleanor said quietly. "That is what we do. We endure, and we do not complain. and we trust that Providence will see us through." She did not believe it herself. But what else could she tell them? The morning passed slowly. Eleanor sat with the children through their lessons, although she could barely focus on the words in their books. By midday, she felt as though she might faint. Luncheon was more bread and weak soup. Dinner would be the same. Tomorrow would be the same. All the tomorrows stretching ahead would be the same, unless something changed. But Eleanor had long ago stopped believing that things could change. She had married a man who saw her as a ledger entry, an expense already paid, and she would endure it until her body gave out, or until death offered her release. That night, alone in her chamber, Eleanor stood before the mirror and barely recognized her reflection. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes were sunken, her collarbones protruded sharply beneath pale skin. She was 28 years old. She looked 50. And somewhere below, in his study filled with gold, Edmund Ashcroft counted his fortune and believed himself a prudent man. Henry Ashcroft understood more than his parents realized. At 9 years old, he had learned to read the silences in Ravensmere, the way his mother's hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, the way his father's jaw tightened whenever anyone mentioned expenses, the way his sisters grew quieter each week, their laughter fading like the colors in old tapestries. He had also learned to hide his own hunger. His tutor, Mr. Pemberton, noticed when Henry's attention wandered during lessons. The old man said nothing, but sometimes he would leave an apple on the desk when he departed. A gift unspoken. Henry would split it 3 ways and share it with his sisters. "You are distracted today, Master Henry." "Mr." Pemberton said one afternoon as Henry struggled through Latin conjugations. "Forgive me, sir. I shall attend better." The tutor set down his book and studied Henry with kind, tired eyes. "When did you last have a proper meal, boy?" Henry went very still. One did not speak of such things. His father had made that clear. "We eat adequately, sir." "That is not what I asked." Henry looked down at his hands. They seemed too thin, the bones too prominent. When had that happened? "My father says excess weakens character," he recited. Mr. Pemberton made a sound that might have been disgust or sorrow. "Your father is a fool." Henry's head snapped up. No one spoke of the Duke that way. No one dared. The tutor stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "I have taught the sons of great houses for 40 years, he said quietly. "I have seen many things. Waste, yes. Extravagance. Boys who had too much and valued nothing. But I have never seen what I see in this house." "What do you see, sir?" "Deliberate cruelty masquerading as virtue." Henry did not know what to say to that. Part of him wanted to defend his father. Another part, the part that woke each night with stomach cramps, wanted to weep. "My sisters," he began, then stopped. "Anne is growing worse. She hardly eats any more." "Have you told your father?" "He knows. He says she will grow stronger through discipline." Mr. Pemberton turned from the window. His face was grim. "Listen to me, Henry. You are young, but you are not powerless. When the time comes, and it will come, you must have the courage to speak. Do you understand?" "Speak to whom, sir?" "To anyone who will listen, before it is too late." That night, Henry lay awake thinking about Mr. Pemberton's words. In the bed beside his sisters slept fitfully. Margaret whimpered in her dreams. Anne's breathing was shallow and quick. He was the eldest, the heir. Someday Ravensmere would be his. Someday he would have the power to change things. But someday felt very far away when his little sister was suffering now. Margaret was 7, old enough to understand hunger, but too young to hide it well. She had taken to hoarding bread crusts under her pillow, eating them in the night when the ache became unbearable. "Why does father hate us?" she asked Henry one afternoon. They were alone in the nursery. Anne was sleeping, exhausted from simply being awake. "He does not hate us," Henry said, though he was not certain he believed it. "Then why does he let us hurt?" How could he explain what he did not understand himself? That their father loved gold more than people? That he had convinced himself deprivation was discipline? "Father believes he is teaching us," Henry said carefully. "He believes we will be stronger for it." "I do not feel strong," Margaret whispered. "I feel like I am disappearing." Henry pulled his sister close. She weighed almost nothing. "You will not disappear," he said fiercely. "I will not allow it." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered how he could keep such a promise. Anne, at 6 years old, had stopped asking questions. She had learned that questions brought no answers, only reminders to be grateful for what little she had. She spent her days in a strange half-sleep, moving slowly through rooms that seemed too large. Sitting quietly through lessons she could not concentrate on, picking at food her stomach could no longer accept. Eleanor watched her youngest child with growing terror. Anne was fading in a way that could not be hidden much longer. The hollows beneath her eyes had deepened to purple shadows. Her skin had taken on a transparency that seemed almost unearthly. "She needs a physician," Eleanor said to Edmund one evening after the children had been sent to bed. They were in his study. She had gathered her courage for an hour before knocking on his door. He had made her wait another 10 minutes before granting entrance. "A physician," Edmund repeated flatly. "For what ailment?" "She is unwell. Surely you can see that." "I see a child who requires fresh air and discipline, both of which cost nothing." "Edmund, please. Oh, she grows weaker every day. She barely eats. She cannot sleep. Then she will learn the value of both appetite and rest when they return to her." Eleanor's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to still them. "Your Grace, I beg you, as her mother, as your wife. Send for Dr. Whitcomb. Let him examine her." Edmund set down his quill with deliberate care. "Do you know what physicians charge for house calls, madam?" "I do not care what they charge. She is your daughter, and you are my wife, purchased at considerable expense. I settled £20,000 worth of debt for the privilege of your hand. I believe that entitles me to make decisions regarding this household without your interference." The word struck like a blow. Purchased, as though she were livestock, as though her value began and ended with the sum he had paid. "You cannot mean that," Eleanor whispered. "I mean precisely that. I have fulfilled my obligations to you and to our children. I have provided shelter, clothing, and sustenance. If you require more, perhaps you should have considered that before your father gambled away his fortune." Eleanor felt something break inside her, some last remnant of hope that he might have hidden depths, that beneath the coldness might lie compassion. There was nothing, that only ledgers and coins and calculations. "Leave me," Edmund said, returning to his work, "and do not trouble me with such requests again." Eleanor left. She climbed the stairs to the nursery where her children slept. She sat beside Anne's bed and watched her daughter's labored breathing, and she understood finally that her husband would let them all starve before he would part with a single sovereign. The fever came on a Tuesday. Anne woke up burning. Her skin was hot to the touch, her eyes glassy with delirium. She called for water but could not keep it down. She shivered despite the heat radiating from her small body. Eleanor sent for Edmund immediately. He came, eventually, Not quickly, not with urgency, but he came. He stood at the foot of Anne's bed, hands clasped behind his back, as observing his daughter as one might observe a disappointing investment. "She has a fever," Eleanor said unnecessarily. "Please, send for Dr. Whitcomb. Fevers pass." "Not always. Edmund, look at her. She is desperately ill." Edmund looked, truly looked, for perhaps the first time in weeks. What he saw should have alarmed him. His youngest daughter, skeletal thin, skin stretched too tight over fragile bones, trembling with fever. Instead, he frowned. "She's overwrought. Keep her quiet. Cool water, if she will take it. The fever will break. And if it does not, then we shall reassess." "When? When she is dying?" Edmund's expression hardened. "You are hysterical. Control yourself, madam. I will not have dramatics in my household." He left, simply turned and walked away from his fevered child without a backward glance, till Eleanor sank into the chair beside Anne's bed. She was not hysterical. She was terrified. For 3 days the fever raged. Anne's small body fought a battle it was too weak to win. She drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for things that made no sense. Sometimes she thought she was in the gardens at her grandfather's estate. Sometimes she believed she was drowning. Eleanor did not leave her side. She bathed Anne's burning forehead with cool cloths. She tried to coax water past cracked lips. She prayed, though she had long ago stopped believing anyone listened. Henry and Margaret came to sit with their sister when they could. They held her hands and told her stories. Margaret sang lullabies their mother had taught them. Henry read from books Anne loved, hoping somehow the familiar words would call her back. Edmund did not return. On the 4th day, the fever broke. But Anne did not improve. She lay listless and pale, barely conscious, her breathing shallow. "Mamma," she whispered once, her voice so faint Eleanor had to lean close to hear. "I am here, darling. Mamma is here." "Am I dying?" The question pierced Eleanor like a blade. "No," she said firmly, though fear clutched at her throat. "No, my sweet girl. You are not dying. You are going to get well." "I am so tired, Mamma." "I know, but you must rest and grow strong again." "Will there be food when I am strong?" Eleanor closed her eyes against the tears threatening to fall. "Yes," she lied. "Yes, there will be food." Anne slipped back into sleep. That night, Eleanor did something she had sworn she would never do. She left the nursery and descended to Edmund's study. She did not knock. She simply opened the door and entered. He looked up, startled by the intrusion. "What is the meaning of—" "Your daughter is dying," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, cold, a stranger's voice. Edmund set down his pen. "She's not dying. The fever has broken." "She asked me if she was dying. A 6-year-old child asked me if she was dying, because she is so weak from hunger that her body cannot fight anymore. That is absurd. She has meals daily. She has bread, thin soup, nothing that could sustain a growing child. You are starving them, Edmund. You are starving your own children." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I am teaching them discipline. You are killing them." The words hung between them, sharp and true. "Get out," Edmund said quietly. "Get out of my study." "No." "I beg your pardon?" I said no, that I will not leave. Not until you send for a physician. Not until you promise to feed our children properly. Not until you act like a father instead of a—" She did not finish. Could not finish, because Edmund moved toward her with such deliberate menace that she took an instinctive step backward. "You forget yourself, madam. You forget who provided for your ruined family. who saved you from disgrace, who gave you the privilege of this name and this house. I have forgotten nothing, least of all the price you remind me of constantly. Then you understand that I owe you nothing beyond what I have already given. You owe your daughter her life. Edmund's face was stone. She will recover, or she will not. That is Providence, not my concern. Now leave before I have you removed. Eleanor looked at the man she had married, truly looked at him, and saw clearly what she had been refusing to see for 7 years. He would never change. He would never soften. He would hoard his fortune while his family withered, and he would call it virtue. She left his study, but she did not return to the nursery. Instead, she went to the servants' quarters and found Graves, the house steward. "Your Grace," he said, clearly startled by her appearance. "Mr. Graves, I need your help." The old man studied her face and seemed to understand something had shifted. "What do you require?" "I need you to send word to my brother. Tell him to come to Ravensmere. Tell him it is urgent." Graves hesitated only a moment. "It will be done, Your Grace." "Thank you." Eleanor returned to Anne's bedside. She did not know what her brother could do, did not know if anyone could help them now, but she knew she could not remain silent any longer. Silence had protected nothing. It had only allowed cruelty to flourish unchallenged. And if her daughter was to have any chance at life, someone had to speak. Edmund received the letter on a Friday morning. It was from Lord Hastings, an acquaintance who had recently purchased an estate 10 miles distant. The letter proposed a small gathering at Ravensmere the following week. Nothing elaborate. A few gentlemen and their families. Music, cards, conversation. Edmund considered refusing. Entertaining cost money. But Lord Hastings was influential. His good opinion could prove valuable in matters of business. He accepted. When Eleanor learned of the gathering, she felt something close to panic. The house was in no condition to receive guests. More than that, she and the children were in no condition to be seen. "Edmund," she said carefully that evening, "perhaps we might postpone. Anne is still recovering from her illness. Anne will remain in the nursery if she is unwell. The gathering will proceed as planned. But the expense is justified when it serves a purpose. Lord Hastings has connections that may prove useful. We will provide adequate refreshments, and no more." Adequate refreshments. Eleanor understood what that meant. A display sufficient to maintain appearances while revealing nothing of what lay beneath. The week that followed was a flurry of preparation. The receiving rooms were cleaned and aired. Silver was polished. The good china, unused for years, was brought out and inspected. Edmund oversaw every detail with his characteristic precision. He calculated exactly how much wine would be required, how many candles, how much coal for the fires in the main rooms, though the rest of the house would remain cold. For the children, new clothes were ordered, not because Edmund cared for their appearance, but because their current garments hung so loosely that even strangers would notice. Eleanor herself was given a dress allowance for the occasion. It was not generous, but it was enough to have her one decent gown altered to fit her diminished frame. "You will conduct yourself appropriately," Edmund informed her. "You will smile. You will make pleasant conversation. You will give no indication of anything amiss in this household." "Of course, Your Grace." "The children will appear for 1 hour, no more. They will be presented, they will demonstrate proper manners, and then they will retire to the nursery. Even Anne? She is still so weak. Especially Anne. I will not have anyone suggesting my children are sickly or poorly cared for." Eleanor said nothing. What could she say? That his children were sickly and poorly cared for? That Anne could barely stand without assistance? that Henry and Margaret had learned to hide their hunger so well they moved through life like ghosts. The evening of the gathering arrived. The main rooms of Ravensmere glowed with candlelight. Fires burned in every grate, a luxury so unusual the children had stared in wonder. The dining table was laid with a meal that, while not extravagant, was more abundant than anything the household had seen in months. Guests began arriving at 7. Lord Hastings and his wife. Sir Thomas Calder was a gentleman of modest means but good reputation. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, the parents of Henry's tutor. 2 other families whose names Eleanor forgot the moment she heard them. Edmund greeted them with perfect courtesy. He was charming when he chose to be. Attentive. His conversation was intelligent, his manner unimpeachable. No one would guess what lay behind the facade. Eleanor smiled until her face ached. She made conversation about gardens and weather and all the meaningless pleasantries that filled such evenings. She accepted compliments on her home, on her husband's management of the estate, on the lovely appearance of the children when they were presented. Henry stood very straight, answering questions with practiced politeness. Margaret curtsied perfectly and spoke when spoken to. Anne, or dressed in a new frock that did little to hide her thinness, smiled with such effort it broke Eleanor's heart. "What beautiful children," Lady Hastings remarked, "so well-mannered." "The Duke insists on proper discipline," Eleanor replied, the words tasting like ash. "Quite right. So many children these days are indulged to ruin." Eleanor nodded and said nothing. Around her, the gathering continued. Wine flowed. Food was consumed with enthusiasm by guests who did not know it was more than the household would see in weeks. Edmund moved through the rooms, accepting praise for his stewardship, his wisdom, his careful management of resources. More than one gentleman remarked on his prudence. "In these times," Lord Hastings said, raising his glass, "when so many live beyond their means, it is refreshing to see a man of sense. That your household is a model of proper economy, Ravensmere." Edmund inclined his head. "I believe in living within one's means. Waste is the enemy of prosperity." "Admirable, truly admirable." Eleanor watched her husband accept the compliments, watched him preen under the approval of men who knew nothing, who saw only the polished surface and never thought to look beneath. The hour came for the children to retire. Henry bowed. Margaret curtsied. Anne attempted both and swayed slightly. Eleanor moved toward her daughter, but Edmund was quicker. "Anne," he said quietly, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her. To the guests, it appeared affectionate. Eleanor knew better. Anne rallied. She smiled at the assembled guests and walked from the room without stumbling. But Eleanor had seen the tremor in her daughter's legs, with the glassiness in her eyes, the way she had to concentrate on each step. The evening continued. Music was played, cards were dealt. Eleanor participated when required, her mind elsewhere. She thought about the food on the table, about how her children would return to bread and soup tomorrow, while the memory of tonight's abundance faded, about how Edmund would count every penny spent and resent it, even as he basked in the praise it earned him. She thought about the lie they were all living, the performance they gave for strangers who saw only what they wanted to see. And she thought about Anne, somewhere above, trying to sleep while her body consumed itself. The gathering ended near midnight. Guests departed with warm words and promises to return the invitation. Edmund stood at the door, accepting their thanks, every inch the gracious host. When the last carriage had pulled away, he turned to Eleanor. "That went well," he said with satisfaction. Lord Hastings was particularly impressed. "Yes, Edmund. You conducted yourself appropriately. I am pleased." "Thank you, Your Grace." He retired to his study to record the evening's expenses. Eleanor climbed the stairs to check on the children. They were all awake. Even Anne, who should have been exhausted, lay with her eyes open in the darkness. "Mamma," Margaret whispered, "why did Father give them so much food?" Eleanor had no answer. Or rather, she had an answer she couldn't speak aloud. Because appearances matter more than truth. Because strangers' approval is worth feeding while his own children are not. "Sleep now," she said instead. "What tomorrow is another day." But she knew tomorrow would bring only more of the same. More hunger hidden beneath manners. More suffering disguised as discipline. More lies. 2 weeks after the gathering, Lord Hastings extended a return invitation. Edmund accepted immediately. To decline would appear ungracious, and Edmund valued his reputation above all else. Eleanor begged him to reconsider. "Anne is unwell," she said. "She grows weaker each day. Please, Edmund, let us remain at home this once. Anne will attend. All the children will attend. We will not give offense by appearing with an incomplete family. She can barely stand. Then she will sit. The matter is settled." On the evening of the gathering, Eleanor dressed Anne with hands that shook. The child was little more than a skeleton wrapped in silk. Her eyes were sunken, her skin paper-thin. When Eleanor lifted her, she weighed less than a bundle of kindling. "Mamma, I don't feel well," Anne whispered. "I know, darling. But we must, or your father insists." "Everything is spinning." Eleanor pressed her hand to Anne's forehead. The fever had returned, not the raging heat of before, but a low, persistent burn that spoke of a body no longer able to fight. "Hold on to me," Eleanor said. "I will not let you fall." They travelled to Hastings Hall in the carriage. Anne sat between her siblings, her head resting against Margaret's shoulder. She did not speak. Eleanor watched her with growing dread. Edmund reviewed his correspondence, oblivious or uncaring. Hastings Hall blazed with light. Carriages filled the drive. Music drifted from the open windows. It was a larger gathering than Eleanor had anticipated. "Remember," Edmund said as they alighted, "you will conduct yourselves with perfect propriety. No one is to embarrass me this evening." They entered the house. Eleanor kept one hand on Anne's back, supporting her without appearing to. The receiving line seemed endless. Anne swayed through each introduction, her smile fixed and empty. "Are you quite well, my dear?" Lady Hastings asked, peering at Anne with concern. "Perfectly well, thank you," Edmund answered before Anne could speak. "She is merely shy in company." They moved into the ballroom. It was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, polished floors, tables laden with food Eleanor knew her children had never tasted. Anne stared at the food with the hollow intensity of starvation. "May I have something to eat, Papa?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Later," Edmund said curtly. "First we must make our greetings." But later never came. Edmund was drawn into conversation with Lord Hastings and his associates. Eleanor was claimed by the ladies. The children were left to stand at the edge of the room, watching others enjoy what they could not have. Henry tried to distract his sisters with quiet conversation. Margaret attempted a brave smile. Anne simply stood, swaying slightly, her eyes growing glassier by the moment. The music began. Dancing. Anne watched the swirling couples with unfocused eyes. Then she took one step forward, one step toward the table, toward the food, toward something, anything, to ease the ache that had lived inside her for so long she could not remember life without it. She took another step. Her legs buckled. She fell. Not quietly, not gently. She fell with a sound that cut through music and conversation and laughter. She fell hard enough that her head struck the polished floor with a crack that silenced the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Eleanor screamed. She pushed through the crowd, dropping to her knees beside her daughter. Anne lay motionless, her eyes closed, her face white as death. "Anne!" Eleanor sobbed, gathering the child into her arms. "Anne, please!" The child's eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" "I am here, darling. I am here." Around them, the guests murmured, concerned, shocked, whispering among themselves. Edmund stood frozen. His face was a mask of controlled fury. This was what he had feared. Public exposure, scandal, his carefully maintained reputation cracking before witnesses. Lord Hastings stepped forward. "Someone fetch Dr. Whitcomb, immediately." "That is not necessary," Edmund said quickly. "The child is merely overwrought." "She has collapsed, Ravensmere. A physician is entirely necessary." A servant was dispatched. Eleanor held Anne, rocking her gently, whispering reassurances that felt like lies. Henry and Margaret stood nearby, their faces pale with fear. The guests had formed a circle around them, watching, judging, seeing, finally, what had been hidden. And Edmund stood apart, his hands clenched into fists, knowing that in this moment everything he had built was about to crumble. Dr. Jonathan Whitcomb arrived within the half-hour. He was a man of 50, greying and dignified, with the manner of one who had seen much and judged little. He had attended births and deaths throughout the county for nearly 30 years. He knew most families in the district. He had never been summoned to Ravensmere. Anne had been moved to a sitting room off the main hall. She lay on a sofa, her head in Eleanor's lap, drifting in and out of consciousness. "Doctor." Whitcomb knelt beside her and began his examination. He felt her pulse, listened to her breathing, looked into her eyes, checked her skin, her hands, her throat. His expression grew increasingly grave. Edmund stood by the door, arms crossed. "Well? What is your assessment?" Dr. Whitcomb did not answer immediately. He continued his examination in silence, his movements careful and thorough. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "This child is severely malnourished." The words fell like stones into still water. "That is absurd," Edmund said immediately. "She eats daily." "Perhaps," Dr. Whitcomb said calmly, "but not nearly enough. This child is wasting. Her body is consuming its own tissue for energy. The fever is secondary to that. Her constitution has been so weakened that she cannot fight even minor illness." Eleanor had gone very still. She had known, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud by a physician, before witnesses, made it undeniable. "You must be mistaken," Edmund said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I am not mistaken. I have seen this condition many times, in workhouses, among the destitute, never in a household of means." The physician stood and turned to face Edmund directly. "How long has she been ill?" Edmund hesitated. "She had a fever some weeks ago." "And you did not send for a physician then?" "It did not seem necessary. Fevers are common in children. This child has not been properly nourished in months, possibly longer. The fever you speak of was merely a symptom of her weakened state." Lord Hastings had entered the room. Along with several other guests, they stood in the doorway, listening. "What treatment do you recommend?" Lord Hastings asked. Dr. Whitcomb looked at Anne, then at Eleanor, then finally at Edmund. "Immediate and substantial nourishment. Beef broth, eggs, milk, small amounts at first, frequently administered, gradually increasing. Warmth, rest, constant supervision to monitor for complications." "And the cost of such treatment?" Edmund asked. The room went very quiet. Dr. Whitcomb stared at the Duke for a long moment. Your daughter's life hangs in the balance, and you ask about cost? I am merely inquiring. The cost is food, Your Grace. Food that any household of even modest means can provide. The cost is what you should have been spending all along to care for your child properly. Edmund's face flushed with anger. How dare you? How dare I? Dr. Whitcomb's voice rose, controlled fury replacing professional calm. How dare you, sir? This child is your responsibility, your daughter, and she is starving. That is an outrageous accusation. It is a medical fact. Look at her. Truly look at what you have allowed to happen. Edmund looked. He saw his daughter, reduced to bone and shadow. He saw his wife, hollow-eyed and trembling. He saw the guests in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of shock and judgment. He saw his reputation crumbling. I will of course provide whatever is necessary, he said stiffly. Will you? Dr. Whitcomb asked. Or will you calculate the precise minimum required and call it sufficient? I resent your tone, Aksa. And I resent having to treat preventable suffering in a household that possesses the means to prevent it. Sir Thomas Calder stepped forward from the group of onlookers. Dr. Whitcomb, what is the cost of the treatment you have outlined? The physician named a sum, modest for a household like Ravensmere, a fraction of what Edmund spent on candles in a year. Edmund began to speak, to calculate, to explain why such expenditure required consideration. Sir Thomas raised his hand. I will cover it, he said quietly. Edmund froze. That is not necessary, he said quickly. It is entirely necessary, Sir Thomas said, his voice cutting through Edmund's objections. The child needs treatment now, not after you have finished deliberating on costs. I will see that, Doctor. De Whitcomb is compensated for his time, and that the necessary provisions are delivered to Ravensmere tomorrow. He looked at Edmund with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Consider it a loan, if you must, to be repaid at your convenience. But everyone in the room understood what it truly was, a public shaming, an indictment delivered not with words but with action. Edmund stood, speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. His carefully constructed image had shattered. His discipline had been exposed as cruelty. His economy had been revealed as avarice, and he had been found wanting before witnesses. Eleanor looked up at Sir Thomas through tears. Thank you, she whispered. He bowed slightly. No child should suffer as yours has, Your Grace. Not when it can be prevented. Doctor. Whitcomb prescribed immediate care and promised to call at Ravensmere the following day. The gathering ended abruptly. Guests made hasty farewells, their conversations muted, their glances at Edmund filled with judgment. The family returned to Ravensmere in silence. Anne slept in her mother's arms. Henry and Margaret stared out the carriage windows. Edmund sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands fisted in his lap. Everything had changed. Edmund did not sleep that night. He sat in his study surrounded by his ledgers and his gold, but for the first time in his life, they brought him no comfort. The physician's words echoed in his mind. Starving, wasting, preventable suffering. Sir Thomas Calder's intervention had been worse than any accusation. The man had not condemned Edmund with words. He had simply acted, by stepping in to provide what a father should have given without hesitation. The humiliation was complete. Edmund opened his strongest box and stared at the gold within. Sovereigns and guineas, carefully sorted and counted. He had accumulated this wealth through discipline, through restraint, through understanding that preservation mattered more than expenditure. But what had he preserved? His daughter lay dying upstairs. His wife was a shadow of the woman he had married. His son looked at him with barely concealed contempt. His reputation, which he had guarded so carefully, lay in ruins. And for what? Gold that sat in boxes, serving no purpose but to be counted. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." Eleanor stood in the doorway. She had not changed from the evening's dress. She looked as though she might collapse at any moment. "Oh, Anne is asking for you," she said quietly. Edmund stared at his wife. In the candlelight he could see how ill she truly was. When had that happened? How had he not noticed? "I will come," he said. He followed Eleanor up the stairs to the nursery. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had avoided this room for months, had told himself the children were the province of their mother and the governess. Now he saw it clearly. The threadbare curtains, the thin blankets, the cold that permeated everything. Anne lay in her small bed, her eyes half open. "Papa!" Her voice was barely a whisper. Edmund approached the bed. He had not been this close to his youngest daughter in weeks. Seeing her now, truly seeing her, was like receiving a physical blow. She was dying. Dr. Whitcomb had not said it directly, but the truth was written in every hollow of Anne's face, every shallow breath. "I am here, Anne." "Am I very ill, Papa?" Edmund found he could not lie to her. "Yes," he said. "You are very ill. Will I get better?" He stopped, started again. "I will do everything in my power to see that you do." Anne's hand, thin as paper, reached for his. "I am sorry I am not stronger, Papa. I tried to be. I tried to learn restraint like you taught, but I am so tired." The words shattered something in Edmund's chest. His daughter was apologizing for being weak, for failing to thrive on the deprivation he had forced upon her. She believed it was her fault. "No," he said, and his voice broke. "No, Anne. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. The fault is mine." She looked at him with confusion. "I do not understand. Papa." "I know you do not, and that makes it worse." He looked at Eleanor, who stood watching from the doorway, her face unreadable. "I have been a fool," he said. Eleanor said nothing. "I believed I was teaching you discipline, teaching you the value of restraint. I believed I was preparing you for a world that does not reward excess." He looked down at Anne's hand in his. "But I was not teaching you anything. I was merely protecting my fortune at your expense. I convinced myself that because I had paid £20,000 for your mother, I owed nothing more. That my obligation ended with the settlement of debts." Anne's eyes were closing. The effort of staying awake was too much. "Rest now," Edmund said gently. "Rest, and when you wake, things will be different. I give you my word." Anne slipped into sleep. Edmund stood slowly, his joints protesting. He felt old, older than his 42 years. Eleanor still stood in the doorway. "Do you mean it?" she asked. "Or are these merely words, spoken in a moment of fear?" Edmund looked at his wife, really looked at her, saw the years of suffering etched into her face, the strength it must have taken to endure what he had inflicted. "I mean it," he said, "though I do not expect you to believe me. I have given you no reason to trust my word." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You have not. Then I will prove it through action. Tomorrow, and every day after." He moved past her toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Eleanor asked. "To my study. There are arrangements to be made." Edmund returned to his study and stood before his collection of ledgers and strong boxes. For 20 years he had built this fortune. For 7 years of marriage he had hoarded it while his family suffered. He opened every box, counted every coin, calculated the total with the same precision he had always employed. The sum was staggering, enough to feed his household lavishly for decades, enough to employ the finest physicians in England, enough to provide comfort beyond anything most families could imagine. And he had let his daughter starve while it sat unused. Edmund began to write instructions to his steward, orders for provisions, authorization for household expenses without his prior approval, a standing account with Dr. Whitcomb, instructions to pay Sir Thomas Calder immediately for his intervention. He wrote until dawn, and when the sun rose over Ravensmere, it illuminated a man who had finally understood that wealth means nothing if it serves only itself. Change came to Ravensmere slowly at first, then all at once, or the morning after the gathering at Hastings Hall, wagons arrived bearing provisions. Not the meagre rations Edmund had once calculated as sufficient, but abundance. Meat and fish, fresh bread and butter, eggs and cream, vegetables and fruit. The servants stared in disbelief. Graves, the house steward, found Edmund in his study. "Your Grace, there has been some mistake. The provisions delivered are far in excess of—" "There is no mistake," Edmund interrupted. "From this day forward, this household will be provisioned properly. The children will eat 3 full meals daily. The Duchess will have whatever she requires. The servants will receive adequate rations. There will be fires in every occupied room." Graves hesitated. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but this represents a significant increase in expenses." "I am aware, and implement it immediately." The change in the household was immediate and profound. Cook wept when she saw the provisions. The maids whispered among themselves, wondering if this was some trick or temporary measure. But it was not temporary. Dr. Whitcomb came daily to attend to Anne. Under his care and with proper nourishment, the child began to improve. Slowly, painfully slowly. But the fever broke and stayed broken. Colour returned to her cheeks. She began to eat small amounts without becoming ill. "She will recover," Dr. Whitcomb told Eleanor after a week, "but it will take months, perhaps a year, before she is truly well." The damage was extensive. "But she will recover," Eleanor repeated, as though saying it aloud would make it more certain. "Yes, Your Grace, she will recover." Eleanor herself began to improve as well. The hollow look faded from her eyes. Her hands stopped trembling. She ate without the constant ache of deprivation. Henry and Margaret gained weight. Their lessons improved. Their laughter returned, tentative at first, then growing stronger. But the household's recovery was only part of the story. Word of what had happened at Hastings Hall spread through the county like wildfire. The story grew with each telling. The Duke who counted coins while his daughter starved. The physician who denounced him before witnesses. The gentleman who paid for treatment the Duke would not provide. Edmund's reputation, so carefully cultivated, lay in ruins. Invitations that had once arrived regularly ceased. Gentlemen who had praised his economy now avoided him. Ladies whispered when Eleanor appeared in public. He had become a scandal. One evening, or 3 weeks after Anne's collapse, Eleanor found Edmund in his study. He sat before his ledgers, but he was not writing. He was simply staring at them. "May I speak with you?" she asked. "Of course." She entered and closed the door behind her. She had not been alone with Edmund since that night. They had maintained a careful distance, speaking only of household matters. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Edmund looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For keeping your word, for the provisions, for Dr. Whitcomb, for allowing the fires to burn, for feeding our children." She paused. "You should not have to be thanked for providing what any father should provide freely. But you kept your promise, and I am grateful." Edmund set down his pen. I am aware of what is being said about me, he said quietly. In the county, while among society. I have heard some of it, Eleanor admitted. Is it very bad? Yes. Edmund nodded slowly. I deserve it. Every word. Eleanor moved closer to his desk. What you did was wrong, she said. What you allowed to happen was cruel. I will not pretend otherwise. You nearly killed our daughter. You made me believe I was worth only the debt you paid to acquire me. You taught our children that hunger was virtue. Edmund flinched as though struck. But, Eleanor continued, you stopped. When confronted with the truth, when your pride was shattered before witnesses, you could have doubled down on your convictions. You could have blamed everyone but yourself. Instead, you changed. It should not have required public humiliation, Edmund said bitterly. I should have seen what I was doing, should have listened to you years ago. Yes, Eleanor agreed. You should have. But you did not. And now we must decide what comes next. Edmund looked at her with something like hope. What do you want, Eleanor? If you wish to leave, to take the children and return to your family, I will not stop you. I will provide for you, generously. You will never want for anything. Eleanor considered this. A month ago, she would have seized the opportunity, would have fled Ravensmere and never looked back. But something had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But she had seen Edmund weep over Anne's bedside, had watched him write orders that went against every instinct he possessed, had observed him accept scandal and censure without complaint. I want our children to grow up healthy, she said, but I want them to know that their father learned from his mistakes. I want them to see that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. You want to stay, Edmund said, as though he could not quite believe it. I want to see if this change lasts, Eleanor corrected. I want to believe that the man who has emerged from this crisis is who you will choose to be. But trust, Edmund, is not given freely. It must be earned. Over years, perhaps. Through consistent action. I understand. Do you? Because this cannot be temporary. You cannot revert to your old ways when the scandal fades or when you grow comfortable again. If you do, I will leave, and I will take our children with me, and you will never see them again. The threat was real. Edmund heard it in her voice. I give you my word, he said. But I know my word means little now, so I will prove it through deed, every day, for as long as it takes. Eleanor nodded and turned to leave. Eleanor, Edmund called as she reached the door. She paused. I am sorry. For everything. For what I put you through. For what I told myself to justify it. For believing that paying £20,000 absolved me of ongoing responsibility. I was wrong. Profoundly, terribly wrong. Eleanor looked back at him. Yes, she said. You were. She left. Edmund sat alone in his study, surrounded by the gold that had once been his god. He understood now what it had cost him. Not in pounds and shillings, but in things that could not be calculated. Trust. Love. The childhood his children should have known. The partnership his marriage might have been. The Duke of Ravensmere had learned that some debts cannot be settled with gold, where some obligations cannot be calculated in ledgers, and some prices are too high to pay. 6 months later, Anne took her first walk in the gardens. She was still thin, still recovering, but she was alive, laughing, playing with her siblings. Edmund watched from the window of his study. His fortune remained substantial, though somewhat diminished by the expenses of proper household management. His reputation in society remained tarnished, though some invitations had begun to return. But his daughter was alive, and for the first time in his life, Edmund Ashcroft understood that this was wealth beyond measure. Years would pass before full healing came to Ravensmere. Anne grew into a young woman of quiet strength, her childhood suffering leaving marks that never fully faded, but also granting her a compassion few possessed. She would dedicate her adult life to charitable work among the poor, never forgetting what hunger felt like. Henry inherited Ravensmere and ran it with careful stewardship, but his definition of careful differed vastly from his father's. His household was known for its generosity, and no child under his roof ever went to bed hungry. Margaret married a physician, perhaps not coincidentally, and found happiness in a partnership built on mutual respect rather than financial transaction. Eleanor and Edmund remained married. Their relationship never became what it might have been had Edmund chosen differently from the start. But it became something honest, a partnership of sorts, built not on romance, but on shared commitment to their children and mutual understanding of past failures. Edmund lived to see his grandchildren. He was, by most accounts, a generous grandfather. He never spoke of the years when his household had starved, but he never forgot them either. The memory served as a constant reminder of what happened when numbers mattered more than people. Some wounds heal, some scars remain. Some truths, once learned, can never be unlearned. This is a story about wealth and worth, about what we choose to value and what we sacrifice in that choice, about the difference between discipline and deprivation, between prudence and cruelty, between economy and avarice. It is a story about how we justify our actions to ourselves, building elaborate philosophies around behavior that serves only our own interests, about how silence enables suffering and how speaking truth, even when costly, can save lives. Most of all, it is a story about change, real change, the kind that comes not from comfortable conviction, but from having every comfortable conviction shattered. Edmund Ashcroft was not a villain in his own story. He believed himself virtuous. His cruelty wore the mask of discipline. His greed masqueraded as prudence. He convinced himself that because he had paid for his wife once, he owed nothing more. That because he provided shelter and minimal sustenance, his duty was fulfilled. He was wrong. But he learned, and that learning, painful as it was, allowed his daughter to live and his family to heal. If you have stayed with this story to the end, if Eleanor's endurance resonated with you, if Edmund's transformation felt real, then perhaps it has served its purpose. We tell these tales to illuminate truths that might otherwise remain hidden, or to show that cruelty often wears respectable clothes, that suffering can be inflicted by those who believe themselves righteous, that change, while difficult, is always possible for those willing to face uncomfortable truths. In our own lives, we encounter Edmund Ashcrofts, sometimes in others, sometimes, if we are honest, in ourselves. We encounter the tendency to justify, to calculate, to convince ourselves that we have done enough, given enough, sacrificed enough. We also encounter Eleanors, people who endure in silence because speaking seems futile or dangerous. People who sacrifice their own well-being for others, who smile through suffering, who carry burdens they should never have been asked to bear. And sometimes, if we are fortunate, we encounter Dr. Whitcombs and Sir Thomas Calders, and people willing to speak truth regardless of social consequences, people who act when others merely observe. The question this story asks is simple, but profound. What do we truly value? And are we willing to examine that honestly, even when the answer makes us uncomfortable? Subscribe to see how more stories like this unfold. Stories of those who endured impossible circumstances. Stories of those who learned too late what mattered. Stories of transformation and reckoning. Of silence broken and truth spoken. Of lives changed by moments of clarity. Comment where you are watching from. I would love to say hello to you, to know how far these words have traveled, to understand whose hearts they have reached. Your presence here, your willingness to witness this difficult story, matters more than you might realize. Thank you for staying until these final words. Thank you for bearing witness to Anne's suffering and Eleanor's endurance. Thank you for watching Edmund's world crumble and rebuild. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important stories are those that make us examine ourselves. These tales of bygone eras carry lessons that remain urgent today. The names change, the setting changes, the specific circumstances change, but the fundamental truths remain constant. Wealth without compassion destroys what it claims to protect. Silence enables cruelty. Discipline without love becomes tyranny. And change, real change, requires the courage to admit we were wrong. Until we meet again in another tale, may you always recognize the difference between what glitters and what nourishes, between what is counted in ledgers and what counts in lives, between gold in strong boxes and warmth in hearts, between discipline that strengthens and deprivation that destroys. May you never be so wealthy that you forget to be human. May you never be so certain of your righteousness that you cannot see your own cruelty. May you never be so focused on preservation that you destroy what you claim to protect. And if you find yourself in Eleanor's position, enduring in silence, may you find the courage to speak. If you find yourself in Edmund's position, convinced of your virtue while inflicting harm, may you find the humility to change. If you find yourself witnessing suffering, may you have the integrity to act. The story of Ravensmere is finished, but its echoes continue wherever people confuse discipline with cruelty, wherever silence masks suffering, wherever change seems impossible until it becomes inevitable. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about stories that matter. Until next time, bye.